Welcome back. This is part 3 of my seminar, and I'm continuing my discussion of the two gravestone studies that I did in Northern and Central Appalachia. And so if we pick back up and we look at the Central Appalachian site and we think about context again, let me tell you a little bit about how this site is different from the Northern Appalachia site. So this cemetery is situated near Main Street in this particular town, and the surnames reflect the descendants of early migrants into Central Appalachia, which was settled primarily by the Scots-Irish, English, and Germans. The Scots-Irish comprise the largest number of immigrants into the Appalachian region. So this cemetery is not as old and it's not as large as that one of Northern Appalachia, but its purpose, like the one in the northern section, may be attributed to a large number of war casualties. So I looked at 298 stones between 1870 and 2014 for a total span of 144 years. This study took place several years following the first study, so the latter dates reflect trends in grave marker technology that were not present in the previous study. So mortality patterns are similar to those in the first study. The cemeteries align with national trends in pre-immunization contagious illnesses and war casualties. But accidents and certain illnesses such as black lung are specific to a region's industries, particularly agriculture, timber harvesting, coal mining, and rail. One notable difference in the two sites is the absence of markers detailing the cause of death. In the Central Appalachian site, it's more rural and populated with fewer stones, and that may just be a statistical difference, but the Central Appalachian study includes stones from more recent years when the cause of death appears less frequently. So let's look at familial roles, since that's one of the primary focus of this study. So the earliest stones in this particular study from 1850 to 1950 include a higher number of occurrences of son and daughter compared to the later years. And with advances in modern medicine from 1930 forward, we see these with less frequency as children are able to grow into adulthood. Much like the Northern Appalachian study, there's a discrepancy between the proportion identifying the woman as wife, which happens in 12% of the stones, compared to those identifying men as husband, which only happens in 2% of the stones. Occurrences of wife in place of a woman's name decreased by 1951. In the timeline of women's history, this trend correlates with social and political gains that women were making. Women are remembered as wife and mother with decreasing frequency between 1850 and 1950. And so there may be a correlation between that and feminist ideology, even as women gain more agency and move into the workforce. However, these roles continue to be revered, as I talked about in part 2. A possible interpretation for this result is the increase in the singular stones that represent the married couple, an upward trend from 2000 forward. And this may follow something called the lawn park design, LAWN, lawn park design, which is a 20th century shift toward standardization of gravestones and cemeteries, and you can see that in this photograph here. So occupational affiliation is very similar to the first study. Greater number of men stones identify their occupations in military service. Women were not allowed to join the U.S. military until 1917, so you would expect to see that with greater frequency after that time. However, in this particular cemetery, I found 33 occurrences of military references for men and only 2 for women. Epitaph and iconography. There are no significant differences in patterns of language or iconography between the two sites. the majority of the 1850 to 1950 stones belonging to men in this site are shaped in what is known as the pulpit style. And while the most common architecture for women is the die-in socket style. And so you can see this is smaller and it's curved, and this is taller. According to the Historical Society, the community was referred to as a lawyer's town. At that time, it was teeming with successful men during that period, and you see that reflected in their gravestones. The pulpit and obelisk styles, these, send messages about men that are typical of the time period, illustrating masculine qualities of dominance, forcefulness, competitiveness, and individualism. So after 1950, the lawn park design had a leveling effect on the architecture of both men and women's stones, with commercial square structures or monuments flush with the ground. So there's a trend now to more flat markers. They're easier to mow. That's what I'm told from caretakers. You can mow over them and you don't have to mow around them. And that's not necessarily a rhetorical thing. It's just an interesting side note. But what's interesting is from 2000 forward, and you can see this in this picture, there's a shift back to more individualism in stones. They're upright, more colorful. They tend to be cut in designs reflecting perceived interests. But women, it's interesting, women still, the titles of mother and wife continue to be privileged on stones, and women are still depicted with iconography like hearts, diamonds, butterflies, angels, and that represents a continuation of hegemonic associations for women in death. Obelisks and pulpit style stones are no longer the norm, but stones with sharper edges and darker colors, presumably more masculine styles, belong to men. So in thinking about what we've learned from these two studies and how these messages reflect rhetorical trends over time, we see that symbolic constructs align with trends in different time periods. Architecture trends toward a standard stone, then back to differentiation. But it's interesting to note that the architecture itself does reflect feminine and masculine styles as associated with men and women. And you see that today. You see that kind of messaging playing out in all different kinds of ways today. If you look, for example, at greeting cards, go to any store and just sort of sweep the greeting cards and take a look at how the colors and the symbolism on those targeting women and those targeting men, you can see same thing. And we also talk about toys. I tell students, you can go to Walmart and you can stand in the toy aisle and you will still see toys that are depicted in more feminine colors, toys that are nurturing type toys, domestic toys that indicate a domestic role, like easy bake ovens or brooms or toy vacuum cleaners. Those are typically found, dolls, those are typically found in the girls' aisle. And then the more action-oriented toys, darker colors, more masculine colors, toys that encourage aggression or encourage movement are more typically found in the boy aisle. And that's interesting that we still see that. And you do see in some ways companies trying to go against that hegemonic depiction. You can see that boys are being included in the nurturing toys and girls are being included in the Lego aisle, for example. there are toys for girls as well. However, those still are depicted in colors of pink and purple, and they still include houses and flowers and nurturing scenes that the girls are supposed to put together. Not always, but it's pretty clear that that is sustained in other messaging as well. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is you can see this in death. It's everywhere, even in death. So even in death, we continue to see this messaging embedded in how we talk about the deceased. However, women do have more agency in how they're represented now. And there is a trend toward more individualistic representations. Iconography and epitaphs correlate with religious patterns in Appalachia. They typically correlate with industry in Appalachia. And that would be the case probably wherever you looked at cemeteries in whatever place they were situated. So something to consider when you are taking students to do this kind of work is they need to go into the site with something they can use for photography, maybe an iPad or their phones. I tell them if they take their iPads, then we create spreadsheets where they can easily mark as they're walking the rows and count. And it's tedious work, and they usually do it in pairs, but they collect the same kind of data that I collected here. They bring it back to the classroom, and that's where we start to make sense of it. We start to look at it in the framework of context, and we look for patterns, and we try to make sense of those patterns through whatever theoretical framework we're using, whether it's the critical lens or one of the feminist lenses or the Burkean lens, whatever it is that we're using at the time. So I wanted to switch gears and pose this question, because we've been talking about messages embedded in gravestones with text and iconography and discernible architecture in the context of a space that we know about, that we can trace through institutional records. What happens when you're in a space like this, like the one you see in this picture, where you have no text, no iconography, no discernible architecture, not at first glance, and very little is known about the space that can be traced through record? How do you read the messages? Can you say that there are messages embedded in stones like this? My argument is there are, and you can. And so what I wanted to do was set up my next session, which is going to talk about the third study that I did in the westernmost part of Virginia, in the burial ground of an enslaved community, according to oral history. I started this research based on the photograph that I showed you in session 1. So let me go to that photograph, and I'll come back to these. This is the site, and you can see it presents a challenge. The photograph here, the one that my great-grandmother had in her home, this land that these graves are these graves are on, belonged to this woman in this photograph. And according to the oral history that I heard, she was a slave owner during the Civil War. Her father was a slave owner in the county, and her homestead is just over the hill from, or what used to be her homestead is just over the hill from this burial ground. And so if we look at these photographs, you can see that it's a heavily wooded area. We had to clear it off. We had to do a lot of clearing in order to uncover the graves because they were covered in something called graveyard ivy or vinca. So this entire ground was covered. And I'm going to take you there in my last session. You're going to go with me to this space. And it looks very different now than it did then, because what happens when you clear the ground, you clear the woods takes it back. And so the graveyard ivy is back again. Trees have fallen and branches have fallen, so it looks very different. But in order to study it, we had to clear it. And in the process of clearing it, we found around 30 stones. And originally we thought there were only 6 or 7 stones. And so that was an interesting development. But as we cleared and as we discovered more and more stones, we started to recognize, and when I say we, I'm talking about my husband because he helped me with clearing the property. We started to recognize that there was a discernible shape to some of the stones. Some of them have this mound shape. Some of them are cut in square shapes or chiseled in square shapes. So these are simple field stones that would have been used by a disenfranchised people with very little literacy, very little money, who wanted to mark the burial space of their loved ones. So in my next session, when I start talking about studying these stones, one of the things that we're going to talk about is in the absence of the traditional codes of death, and I talked about this in my first session as well, in the absence of traditional codes of death, how can you read placement or order syntactics? How can you read syntactics together with the architecture of the stone and what we know about the context of the region and the history? And so in my next session, we'll begin with the history of this particular region, because I had to build a narrative of what that story probably looked like for the people who lived there. And it was an interesting journey through time, because some of these people were my family and I didn't know anything about them. I didn't think to ask questions of my oldest relatives about this until it was too late. And, you know, because so few people could actually read and write when census records were being kept and things like that, it's very, very hard to trace people on paper from this particular era in this particular part of Virginia. So it's presented a lot of challenges, but it's also been a fascinating study in rhetorical messaging in these kinds of stones and these kinds of spaces. So I look forward to talking with you about it in part 3.